The offensive to retake the city of Mosul is finally over. After months, fierce and tough battle, the Iraqi army defeated the Islamic State. But at what cost? How many civilians lost their lives? How many soldiers lost their lives? And what is the situation of the city? Join me, Daniele Pagani, as I revisit Mosul. I was there when the battle for the city began, the only Indian channel on the ground. And now join me on the Victory Lap, only on WION. World is One News.
I mentioned that we'd be talking a lot about West Asia on this broadcast, and that is the continued approach we're taking tonight on the 8 p.m. broadcast. A Syrian military jet has been shot down near the ceasefire zone in the southwestern part of the country, further straining the uneasy truce reached between the United States and Russia last week. The incident took place barely 48 hours after the ceasefire came into effect on Sunday and comes amid a new round of peace talks taking place in Geneva. Allegations have flown thick and fast since then, with rebels first claiming that the aircraft was shot down over the ceasefire zone. Then the Syrian government sources maintained that their aircraft had targeted the so-called Islamic State near the ceasefire zone, which was outside the ambit of that agreement. It was the second Syrian military jet to be shot down in less than 1 month. On the 18th of June, if you remember, the United States had shot down a Syrian aircraft near the town of Rasafa, near Raqqa, which is the de facto capital of the Islamic State terror group. Now, the ceasefire zone comprises the province of Quneitra, Soweda and Daraa, bordering Israel to the west and Jordan to the south. The contours of the ceasefire agreement were negotiated at Amman, the capital of Jordan, before President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin put their stamps of approval on it. It's not the first time that a ceasefire agreement has been brokered in Syria or broken. It remains to be seen whether it will hold this time around. Will the latest ceasefire allow the rebel forces to regroup? Will it impede the advance made by the Syrian and Russian forces in recent weeks, especially near Raqqa and Deir el-Zor, the two last ISIS strongholds in Syria? There are no easy answers just yet. To answer some of those uneasy questions, I'm joined on the broadcast by Zain Abbas, Syrian lawyer. He is joining us from New Delhi. Also with us is Professor Stephen Golub, an international affairs expert from California. Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks very much for being here on the broadcast with us. Professor Golub, can I come to you first? Who stands to gain the most if the ceasefire is jeopardized?
That's a good question, and thanks for having me. Quite possibly the Assad forces, the government forces of Syria, stand to gain the most because they have the potential to take the greatest advantage of the ceasefire or to quickly rebound and seize territory if it falls apart. Already there are indications of fighting of Assad forces seizing 7 villages in a part of the zone that might be part of the ceasefire. One of the many problems or ambiguities about this whole arrangement is that it's still unclear exactly what territory is covered, as evinced by the seizure of territory by the government forces, as well as who will enforce it, who will monitor it. All sorts of things are up in the air.
Zain, if I can ask you, one of the questions that the report we just looked at a short while ago did ask is that does this ceasefire, and if it is to, come through for a lengthy period of time, does it allow time and space to anti-Assad forces to regroup?
Well, today this is one of the main factors that we fear, that maybe this ceasefire would give these armed forces, those terrorist groups, the opportunity to regather and to be in a position where to launch again attack against the Syrian army. Let me tell you, when the ceasefire started, the Syrian army forces had an advantage. We were winning the battle, and then the ceasefire came in at a point where we were in a situation about to free the southern part of Syria. So yes, today we question this ceasefire, whether the armed groups will take advantage out of it to regather themselves and launch an attack against our government forces.
Effectively, Zain, though, what exactly does this ceasefire stand for when it comes to Syria, when it comes to President Assad? Does it really mean anything at all?
Let me tell you this. The ceasefire that was declared days ago, it does not mean a lot to the Syrian government because, as I mentioned earlier, we are in a situation where we are winning the battle against these terrorist groups. Second thing, the ceasefire would have been more effective if they had declared that we should also stop the source of funding for these groups in Syria and to block the supply of weapons to those terrorist groups. So today, this ceasefire will only, for us, for the Syrian government, paves the way for the peaceful resolution there. We are inviting today the people or those terrorist groups to surrender their arms and for the civilians to get back to their homes.
Professor Golub, what do you make of the contention that this ceasefire has been brokered by the United States and Russia that have been in the news for all sorts of reasons over the last couple of months, and the fact that it sort of takes away from the work that's being done by pro-Assad forces and the Syrian president himself in Syria? Do you think that it's taking advantage of the situation for a larger presence on the global front?
Well, I think I disagree with your other guest respectfully in many respects, but one way in which we may agree is that this was imposed by the US, Russia, and Jordan as the third party. It was not agreed to by the forces on the ground. This was a three-government agreement from governments outside of the zone of conflict, although Jordan certainly borders right on it. In terms of who will take advantage of it, we may, and your other guest's characterization of all forces, if I understood him correctly, of all forces opposing the Syria government as being terrorist, that I would very much disagree with. There are some groups that are legitimately fighting the Syrian government, some that are terrorist groups affiliated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It's important to make a distinction between those terrorist or violent extremist groups on the one hand, and the more legitimate forces that are fighting the Syrian government to avoid or its oppression, the crimes it has committed on the other.
Professor Golub, do the reports, unconfirmed even now, of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi being killed further complicate or simplify the situation in Syria?
Oh, it may, that's hard to tell right now. It may simplify the situation in terms of removing one potential obstacle to peace on the ground. But there are 99 other obstacles to peace on the ground there, unfortunately. So how this will all play out is unclear. I would not make too much of that event in and of itself as leading towards peace in Syria. There are many, many other factors in the way, not least, not only, but not least the fact that the U.S. and Russia have fundamentally different foreign policy goals there. The U.S. is to remove Assad, Russia is to sustain Assad in power.
Zain, also going off of what both of you have said, you know, the one thing that also stands out is the fact that there are so many players involved when it comes to Syria. Who's backing who, how many groups are there, who's holding hands and when. There's also the question of the mishmash when it comes to airspace. Do you think that there's just so much going on in Syria that the real cause of it all is being lost in too many parties being involved? The fact that the Syrian people are suffering, that the suffering has been going on for a long, long time, and that there seems to be no resolution if this continues to be a sort of a brokerage of power taking place with different parties involved.
Well, let me tell you, I just would like to answer our dear guest when he mentioned that he disagrees with me on the point that there are legitimate forces on ground. See, this is exactly the problem why we're not able to reach a solution in Syria. Until and unless the West would agree that the groups that are armed in Syria belongs to a terrorist background, we won't find a solution for the conflict in the region. Today, the most important part is the West is still insisting to say that there are moderate, legitimate forces in Syria. Today, we cannot accept these terms or this name for these groups anymore. The fight in Syria is between government forces and terrorist groups. My dear friend, let me tell you, for the last 7 years till now, we have not seen a moderate group fighting against the government. They all have Salafist, Wahhabist, terrorist backgrounds, with the flags clearly mentioning a jihadist logo and logos on their flags. So please, let's not say that we have legitimate forces fighting against the government. If that's the case, then the government would not have been today in a powerful position.
Professor
The fight in
Golub,
Syria is...
Professor Golub, would you like to respond?
Fundamentally disagree. I'd say the illegitimate force on the ground in Syria is the Assad government. It slaughtered hundreds of thousands of its own people, committed gas attacks, committed other human rights abuses. As if I may, please.
Then allow the professor to complete. I'll give you time to respond. Professor Golub, please go ahead.
Thank you. This has been documented by many independent observers, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by intergovernmental official organizations. This is really almost not in dispute. Now, we could dispute the details of what's going on the ground. I agree it's a very, very complex situation, but to boil it down to the legitimate, supposedly legitimate Assad forces on the one hand, and illegitimate terrorist forces on the other, vastly simplifies the situation as a point of analysis and vastly underplays the crimes and human rights abuses that Assad has committed.
Zen?
Yes, please. I would like to comment on this. My friend, till now we don't have any official reports stating that the government has used chemical weapons against its people. Please, let's forget about these fabricated materials or the propaganda against the government. We have asked international committee to come visit the area and to investigate under the United Nations observation. The chemical weapons of Syria has been taken away from the Syrian government in the year 2013 under the supervision of the United Nations. So today, if you say that the Syrian government is launching attacks using chemical weapons against its people, I mean, it's nonsense. Sorry to say this in this way. It's nonsense. And the second thing, the Syrian government today is in a winning position. Why shall the government use chemical weapons when it's winning? So that's, again, I might say it's, again, a false accusation of the government.
All right.
And for the last 7 years, please let me just mention this.
Go ahead.
For the last 7 years, we have been asking to go for a political, peaceful solution in Syria. We have asked for re-elections under the observation of the United Nations. If you believe in democracy, then please, let's start an election in Syria where Assad can stand for this election in Syria. My friend, today Assad and the government has the support of majority of the people in Syria. No power can actually stand against the power of its people. If the regime in Syria did not have the support of the Syrians, then who's fighting in support of Assad or the regime?
Right.
Today from this channel, I would actually just ask the dear guests to come to Syria, visit Syria, to see the real situation in Syria. We cannot today call those rebels as moderate rebels. Today there is no difference between a moderate and...
Zen, allow me to come in.
Yes,
I'm running out of time on this segment, unfortunately, and clearly there's no resolution on this conversation either. I appreciate the two of you being civil and putting your points across. Absolutely, I understand, Zen, that everyone has a point of view, and it's important that we allow time and space for both sides of the story to be put forth. Professor Golub and Zen Abbas, I thank you both for joining us here on the broadcast on WION. Appreciate you taking out the time and giving us your perspectives. We'll, of course, continue to track closely all developments coming out of Syria and, of course, about that ceasefire agreement that came into play just 48 hours ago.